Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maeve Clark, and I'm the Adult Services Coordinator here at the Iowa City Public Library. Thank you so much for coming, and I'm so pleased to welcome Ann Stapleton, not only because she is an expert on, not only because we have an expert on Scotland here to speak the day after the Scottish referendum, and she assures me that she's up to that. Any questions, any and all questions. But mostly I am glad to welcome Anne because of her boundless enthusiasm for her subject, Sir Walter Scott, the Waverley novels, and why there are so many gosh darn Waverleys across the United States. And we have the library director from Waverly, Iowa here to learn more about why there's so many Waverleys across the United States. Anne and I have had many conversations on the topic, and we could talk for hours more. And I know that you'll all want to learn more about Waverly and Scott. And in fact, today, sorry, I'm turning it into about me, but today I learned that Walter Scott was a huge fan of dogs, and I'm sure she will like to answer questions about that at the end of her program as well. Back to Anne. Anne received her PhD in 2001, her MA in 1997, and her BA with honors all in English from the University of Iowa. But there's more. Anne also earned a BS in nursing in 1979 from the University of Kansas. She is currently a lecturer in English at the University of Iowa. Before I turn the program over to Anne, let me read to you from her page on the University of Iowa's University of Iowa Department of English's website. It was written in the first person. I've changed it to the third person. I am not Anne. Anne's teaching, research, and writing explore the relationship between literature and culture of late 18th and 19th century Great Britain, with a particular focus on Scotland. She is especially intrigued by literary representations of national and regional identities in poetry, songs, fiction, and autobiographical works. Archival research in England and Scotland, a vital aspect of her work, uncovered a number of significant texts which led to her current project entitled Negotiating Nationalism, Scottish Dance in Post-Culloden Literature. By tracing the central motif of Highland dance as an outwardly conforming but covertly subversive expression of Scottish nationalism, she investigates Scottish musical traditions and the literary forms developed between 1750 and 1830. Anne.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Maeve. That was a lovely introduction, and I fear I must correct what I have on my website because the current project is actually now a book, and it's actually entitled Pointed Encounters, Dance in Post-Culloden Scottish Literature, but it is indeed about the topics that you address, so thank you so much for your generous introduction. What I'd like to do today is introduce you to Walter Scott, his Waverley novels, and some of the many Waverley towns, particularly in the Midwest, although the Waverley phenomenon is global in its extent. I have to figure out. So, Walter Scott, the first half, Walter Scott, ballad collector, scholar, poet, lawyer, sheriff deputy of Selkirkshire, historian, literary critic, reviewer, essayist, biographer, family man, and most important for our discussion today, best-selling fiction writer. Scott was a literary rock star. Immensely popular throughout the 19th century, Walter Scott's novels outsold all other novels in the decade they appeared, including those by his contemporary, Jane Austen. Waverley, or To 60 Years Since, was published anonymously in 1814 and is considered the first historical novel. It inaugurated a staggeringly successful series that became known as Waverley novels, since Scott signed subsequent novels by the author of Waverley until he publicly acknowledged authorship in 1826. Their popularity grew to such heights that eponymous towns appeared across the globe, unifying public imagination as fans settled in new communities. Waverly, Iowa is one such town. In 1859, Waverly was named by William Harmon in the hope its citizens would embody the, quote, honor, courtesy, and generosity, end quote, Scott's novels espouse. Historical in content, yet modern in conception, Scott's stories also inspired readers and provided them an imaginative way to remember the past, articulate contemporary values, and define their identities in these new settings. His 28 novels provide a panoramic vision of Scotland's diverse geography, history, and culture, and bring to life unforgettable characters from across Scotland. Perhaps more importantly, the novel's creative impact captured a sense of Scottishness and Scottish nationhood at a time the country was without independent political institutions. As news events of the past several months have shown, Scotland is passionate about its unique cultural identity, despite being wedded politically to Great Britain. Today, I'd like to explore how Scott developed such an influential view of Scotland and her people, and then suggest why Midwesterners also may have found Scott's novels so intriguing. Yes. First, Scott illuminated identifiably Scottish landscapes in striking ways. So long before the Pirates of the Caribbean hit the big screen, Scott entertained readers with The Pirate, published in 1822, set in the Shetland Islands in the late 17th century. Scotland consists of about 30,000 square miles, or 790 plus islands, including the Hebrides to the west and Orkney and Shetland archipelagos to the north. Here are just some views from the Shetland Islands. Scott gained much inspiration for the people and scenery in his novel from a voyage he made in 1814 around the coast of Scotland with the famous lighthouse engineer Robert Louis Stevenson's grandfather, who was scouting out sites for lighthouses among the magnificent scenery. In 1854, Robert Louis Stevenson helped his uncle and father build this lighthouse, Mucklefluga. Everybody should say that, Mucklefluga. This is on the northernmost coast of the northernmost Shetland Island. It's off the coast, obviously, the lighthouse is. And this actually is a map of Harmon Nature Center, which some say is the template for the map in Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. Here are a few Puffin Birds. They live up there too. Oh, isn't it cute? The scenery's gorgeous. Scott also showcased the Highlands. Better known, although the least populated area, the Highlands exist north and west of the Highlands boundary fault, dominated by an extensive mountain mass, great glens, and large lochs or lakes. That was Loch Lomond, and so is this. In Waverly, the young and very naive English protagonist named Waverley comes of age during the final and disastrous Jacobite rebellion of 1745-6. His adventures unfold throughout Scotland, but most memorable are the Highland scenes where the wild beauty bursts upon Waverley, as if by magic, and his life's real history commences. Rob Roy, the Legend of Montrose, and the Fair Maid of Perth also take place in the Highlands. Likewise, the Lowlands commanded Scott's attention. This, and she show the boundary fault line. This actually runs through the Isle of Bute. And if I were on the other side, it would say, welcome to the Lowlands. And so the fault line geographically and geologically runs straight through at an angle through the islands and through Scotland. This is St. Ninian Bay on the same Isle of Bute. And this is St. Abbs on the east coast. Many of Scott's novels explore southern Scotland and the Lowlands, from the Galloway coast in Guy Mannering, the second novel, inhabited by smugglers, gypsies, and young lovers, to East Lothian in The Bride of Lammermoor and St. Ronan's Well, with contemporary Scottish spa scenes that vie with Jane Austen's set in Bath, just to pique your interest. All unique places and regional cultures. By the way, Iowa, in contrast, is 56,272 square miles, according to my references. So Scotland is almost half the size of Iowa, but in contrast, incredibly diverse geographically. While people settled most heavily in the more fertile lowland areas for farming after industrialization in the 18th and 19th centuries, populations were drawn to Glasgow and Edinboro. Here's Edinboro. Oops. And that's the Castle of Edinboro. Between the 1750s and 1831, during Walter Scott's lifetime, Scotland's population rose 88%. Edinboro, where Scott was born, went to school and lived much of his life. And Edinboro became known as the Athens of the North. Between 1802, the year the Edinboro Review was founded, and Scott published 2 volumes of Minstrelsy of the Scottish Borders. In 1832, the year of the Reform Bill and Scott's death, Scottish publications dominated the English language market and made Edinboro a literary metropolis to rival London, as Ian Duncan argues. One of Scott's most acclaimed novels, The Heart of Midlothian, opens in Edinboro during the early 18th century and features an extraordinary heroine named Jeanie Deans, who travels to London primarily on foot to seek royal pardon for her imprisoned sister. The regenerative view of Scotland The Heart of Midlothian offers stands in striking contrast to the Highland clearances ongoing the same decade it was published. The clearances, a forced displacement of significant numbers of people due to a reorganization of traditional land tenancies, radically changed the Highlands between 1770 and 1860s. One notorious incident, between 6,000 and 10,000 people were relocated to coastal crofting communities during the Sutherland clearances carried out between 1811 and 1820. Now, Waverly was published in 1814, the first of these novels. So Scott's publishing during this immense change, while the land was being turned over to large-scale sheep farming operations. At the end of Waverly, Scott reflects on Scotland's cultural upheaval. Quote, "There is no European nation which, within the course of half a century or little more, has undergone so complete a change as this kingdom of Scotland. This race has now almost entirely vanished from the land," end quote. It's awfully sad. Thus, he tells his readers, his purpose is to preserve, quote, "some idea of the ancient manners of which I have witnessed the almost total extinction," end quote. Although Scott's literary presence at Edinboro was enormous, his experiences living with his grandfather in the Borders, gathering ballads for Minstrelsy of the Scottish Borders, and touring and researching Loch Katrine and Loch Lomond for his famous poem Lady of the Lake, published in 1810, and novel Rob Roy, showed him firsthand Scotland's rapidly changing ways of life. Here's his home in Edinboro. Following Scott's death in 1832, a competition was held to design a memorial, and the tower was completed in the autumn of 1844, if I knew how to do this. So the memorial is that tall edifice just there on the edge of the screen. And that's the inside. It has a list and carvings of all the Waverly novels up and down the inside. I know you'll all want to go visit when you're in Edinboro next. So geography, that was one diverse aspect of Scotland. The second, linguistics, linguistically. Besides highlighting remarkable topography in a setting, Scott captured a regional diversity through characters who spoke in different dialects. Because many peoples inhabited Scotland over the centuries, the languages within the country varied. Most readers didn't know Gaelic, so Scotland dramatizes the power of language in scenes that pique readers' interest, such as when Waverly almost falls, quote, "sacrificed to his ignorance of the ancient language," end quote. In other words, he almost dies, when his English ears fail to hear a warning of danger. Now, this is a sign actually in the Highlands, as you can see, Glasgow. I won't even try to pronounce the Gaelic. And the word, it looks like Gaelic and Irish, but the Scots pronounce it Gaelic. So they do have both languages on the roadsides in the Highlands. Scott also provides English translation for Gaelic poems and occasionally defines words parenthetically for readers. A second language, Scots, was and is the language of much of Lowland Scotland. Many memorable characters speak in Scots, such as Meg Merrilies, the gypsy prophetess, who predicts the protagonist's future in Scott's ballads and dies after fulfilling her destiny. "I kenned it would be thus, and it's e'en thus that it should be." English, of course, was the academic or schooled language, and Norn was spoken in the Northern Islands, the Orkney and Shetland Isles, off the north coast of mainland Scotland, and then the far north of the Scottish mainland. Norn gradually became extinct after Orkney and Shetland were pledged to Scotland by Norway in 1468-9 and was replaced by Scots. I've wondered whether Norna of the Fitful Head and the Pirate, a mysterious woman with supernatural powers and a slow, majestic step, reflects the language Norn in her speech. Scott's use of language in both his poems and novels is very complex, both reflecting the individuality of the characters he develops and disrupting prejudices about speakers of the native languages of Scotland. Only a few decades before Scott's novels became popular, many Lowland Scots regarded Highlanders as, quote, a different and inferior race, violent, treacherous, poverty-stricken, and backward, end quote, as historian Linda Colley explains. And Highlanders who spoke Gaelic called English speakers Sassenach, whether English-born or English-speaking Scottish Lowlanders, both equally alien to their experiences. In fact, novels of the period actually describe the Highlands as a country, that people thought of it as a country, and the Lowlands as a different country, indeed. In addition, teachers often prohibited Gaelic or Scots in schools. So Scott takes on all languages to reflect the four peoples, Picts, Scots, Britons, and Angles, who coalesced centuries earlier to create Scotland. Third topic, religion. I want to mention religion briefly after geography and language, since Scott explores that central topic too. Scotland emerged with a strong Protestant identity, although the civil wars of the 16th century and religious wars of the 17th century were quite bitter, with strong clashes between Catholics and Protestants, Presbyterians and Episcopalians, Highlanders and Lowlanders, and Scots and Britons. Areas with traditionally different religious beliefs were very loosely Catholic, mainly in the Highlands and Islands initially, Anglican, predominantly in the northeast, and Presbyterian in the Lowlands. As historian Colley points out, during the time Scott was writing, the successive wars against Catholic enemies, meaning the French, provided, quote, a powerful justification for a united Great Britain and a Protestant Great Britain, end quote. And it really gave many people a sense of British identity, people coming together. However, I also think Irish and Scottish writers of the period highlighted national and regional differences in their own countries as powerful and unique cultures not to be forgotten. For example, Old Mortality, published in 1816, is set in 1679 against the backdrop of the military campaign waged by John Graham of Claverhouse's governmental forces against a Covenanting army. The Scottish Covenanters had risen against Charles II in protest to the reintroduction of Episcopalian church government. This led to the expulsion of many ministers, mainly to the west of Scotland, who had refused to take an oath of allegiance or to submit themselves to bishops. The expelled ministers continued to conduct worship in remote country spots, and the attempt to break up these conventicles by military force and continued persecution of the Covenanters led to open revolt. So some accuse Scott of caricaturing the Covenanters and whitewashing the Royalists in this novel, but many reviewers felt Old Mortality was one of his best. Thus, Scott reflects current concerns about religious differences against the historical backdrops that allow readers thoughtful consideration of his topics. And finally, Scott explores flashpoints of political discord in his novels through likable characters who encourage readers to rethink inflexible viewpoints. For example, and my students are reading this just now, I'm so delighted, they love it, I'm sure they love it, Waverly. He situates his young protagonist Waverly in the midst of the final Jacobite rebellion of 1745 against the Hanoverian government. Waverly was reared primarily by his pro-Jacobite uncle, but he is by birth the son of a Hanoverian member of parliament. Thus is the Englishman, Waverley, now captain of a regiment of Hanoverian forces, travels north through Scotland and becomes entangled in political intrigue as the rebellion begins. The narrator invites the reader to undertake a similar journey of discovery and to rethink through unprejudiced eyes issues demanding consideration on both sides of the Anglo-Scottish border. All right, Let's see if I'm up. Oh, this is a bit of maybe taken from Norrin, Dunachuk Brook. Don't throw trash away. That's up in the Shetland Islands. I love that sign. Oh. These are Waverleys, just to pique your interest. By date. Now I'd like to read you a poem, An Apology by John Clinton, no relation to Bill, 1923. Sir Walter Scott, he never saw the Cedar River here, or Lover's Lane, or ever drank some good old Waverly cheer. He never paddled on our beach, or spent a cent in town, yet history throws him on the spot and puts him plainly down as having written novels concerning Waverly. It just occurred to me that was true the other day. So that the Waverly novels may be brought up to time, there follows on these pages a little novel rhyme. Some, perhaps, you'll read clear through, and then at some you'll falter. I have written this appendix with apologies to Walter. Okay, 1923. While John Clinton's apology, published in 1923, facetiously describes the wonders Walter Scott missed by never visiting the town of Waverly, Iowa, his poem also points to the sway of Scott's novels. Just as Scott's characters traverse the North Sea, Highland, Lowland boundary fault, and River Tweed, so too his Waverly novels cross the Atlantic Ocean, Mississippi River, and Missouri River, mapping an extensive swath of Midwest readers and new settlements. From the states of Ohio to Nebraska, towns named Waverly burgeoned forth between 1830 and 1880 as settlers established ports, canals, and railroad systems to access major waterways and undeveloped prairies. New arrivals to the Midwest, such as Captain Francis Cleveland, chief civil engineer for the Ohio Erie Canal, he was from New York, christened Waverly, Ohio. I have to keep up with all the Waverlys. This is Waverly, Ohio, due to his fascination with one of Scott's novels he was reading at the time. Likewise, William Harmon, who hailed from Maine and became captivated by the prospects of the Cedar River and the fertile land surrounding it, founded Waverly, Iowa in 1859. Other Waverlys appeared in Indiana. They actually have two. New Waverly, I believe it's 1850s, is up north. Older Waverly is down south. Illinois, Kansas, and Nebraska. Waverly, Nebraska, this really excites me, even named streets after Scott's novels and characters. And there's one. I have more, but I didn't think I'd include them now. The Waverly novels clearly intrigued Americans as they settled in the Midwest, even as they connected readers across the world. The very same decade that William Harmon established Waverly, Iowa, 3 railway stations on adjacent sites fused to become Edinboro's Waverly Station. Despite a distance of almost 4,000 miles, both Waverly, Iowa, and Edinboro, Scotland, shared progressive visions and made plans for the future, often kindled by Scott's imaginative fiction. Poised as a threshold between increasingly contentious constituencies, the Midwest, like Scott's novels, offered engagement that embraced a variety of viewpoints and tended to deflect rigid ideologies. In The Afterlives of Walter Scott, Memory on the Move, Anne Rigney argues that Scott's novels, quote, helped specifically in stimulating identification across existing social and ethnic borders in a way that was well matched to an age where people were migrating, mixing, and ever more connected through media, in part due to the pantheon of imaginary and historical figures that provided a collective point of reference for a multinational readership, end quote. This pantheon of characters and multiple historical periods appealed to readers for a variety of reasons. While many people have described Ivanhoe's influence on cultural practices and ideas of heroism in the South, southern United States, the impact of the Waverly novels in the Midwest has remained largely unexamined. I proffer an alternative to Mark Twain's explanation that Scott's central influence in America, and you may have read about this before, Scott's central influence in America, that Scott's literary enchantments turned back progress, did measureless harm, and even made Scott, quote, in great measure responsible for the Civil War, end quote. Instead, I suggest that the establishment of multiple towns called Waverly in the Midwest reveal a vibrant engagement with the modern world that encourage conciliation rather than dissension between and amongst regional constituencies. So why the Midwest? Well, as a borderland between North and South, East and West, it is not, as you all well know, simply a flyover zone. The Midwest, Midlands or Middleland, as the central portion of the United States is variously known, served as an area of negotiation where different ideologies naturally collided in the 19th century as populations intermingled at an increasingly accelerated pace. Boundaries mattered to these landlocked citizens as they decided political allegiances and organized governance. But borders also united Americans as they structured and helped manage disparate populations and environments. Midwesterners benefited from the negotiation that unfolded in the region. As many Missourians, Kansans, and Iowans discovered, in fact, homogeneity was less significant than the strength of cooperative and tolerant communities, a concept they may have felt illustrated collectively in novels like Waverly, Guy Mannering, Old Mortality in the Heart of Midlothian, among others. For one thing, fiction encouraged people everywhere to imagine the value of crossing or ignoring borders, as Andrew Caton explains. Furthermore, Scott's novels held a powerful emotional appeal for 19th century readers, and plots tended to end on a note of hope for the future, as Susan Manning explains. While they explore regional and national differences and contrast sometimes oppositional ideologies, the Waverly novels frequently advocate a flexible position, most convincingly shown by ordinary people in extraordinary historical moments. In addition, as narratives of travel and discovery, they link history to geography and exploration, a distinct reality to which Americans could relate as they moved through or settled in the Midwest. Waverly, Missouri, for instance, originally held the name Middletown and developed along the eastern portion of the Santa Fe Trail by the port of the Missouri River, a major hub of commerce and travel. In fact, Waverly did a larger shipping business than any other point on the Missouri River during its heyday, a reality about which Mark Twain was likely aware, since Twain's hometown of Hannibal, Missouri, a setting, as you know, for the adventures of Tom Sawyer and the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, lies just east of Waverly, Missouri, and 30 miles west of Waverly, Illinois. Similarly, Waverly, Iowa is situated along the Cedar River, and in 1853 was chosen as the county seat because of its growth, commercial position, and railroads. Illustrative of the surrounding state, Waverly stood Janus-faced between the industrial, urban world to the east and the agrarian past to the west, a sort of transitional zone for people moving to the Great Plains, as Dorothy Schweiter explains. Midwestern Waverlys also exemplify Colin Woodard's argument that the Midwest developed into a sort of buffer between the North and South. Quote, a collection of mutually tolerant ethnic enclaves, end quote, that became, quote, a center of moderation and tolerance, where people of many faiths and ethnicities lived side by side, largely minding their own business, end quote. So here's a map taken from Colin Woodard's book called American Nations. It's a really interesting book. I find Woodard's map of what he calls the Midlands especially fascinating because it encompasses or parallels all of the Waverlys I've just mentioned in that sort of light blue area there going through the center. Coinciding with the constellation of towns named for Scott's series, the dramatic growth of railroads also counters Twain's omission of Scott's more progressive influence in the United States. The dramatic growth of railroads during the 1850s and into the 1860s also paralleled the establishment of towns named Waverly in the Midwest. For example, between 1854 and 1857, 3 trunk lines radiating from Chicago reached Iowa's eastern border on the Mississippi River. And by 1869, all 3 had reached the western border of the state, and Council Bluffs having been joined by a 4th line, as Sheldon Stromquist shows. Both Waverly, Kansas and Waverly, Nebraska were founded at the intersection of railroads, and in Nebraska, The depot, constructed in 1871, became the social center of the developing community with dances and singing schools held there. So these towns, like the Waverly novels, embraced a rapidly transforming history that stood at the intersection of modernity and cultural change. Similarly, like the transnational railroads wending their way across the United States, the first trans-border Anglo-Scottish railroad line began in 1845, constructed by the Northern British Railway, with the purpose of connecting Edinboro and Carlisle, one of the sites actually Waverly travels to during his ventures in Waverly. Once the line opened, 1862, it became known as the Waverly Line, marking the route and rapidly unfolding the landscape of Edward Waverly's travels north to south and back again. Linking even more travelers and commercial relationships, Edinboro's Waverly Station merged 3 stations on adjacent sites in 1854, the North Bridge Station, General Station, and Canal Street Station. So in many ways, railway stations radically transformed Scottish cities mid-century too. I'm afraid I'm not sure that you can see them all. In conclusion, these are the Waverly novels. Walter Scott's novels clearly influenced the evolution of towns named Waverly across the Midwest. Just as they inspired the New American Waverly magazine begun in 1850, both sought to encourage Americans to understand the world unfolding around them through specific points of comparison to Scott's fiction. For the founder of Waverly, Iowa, Scott's characters provided models for citizens to emulate as they created their new community, while the publisher of the Waverly magazine drew upon Scott's genius to inspire American writers of all genres of literature. This was actually first published in 1850, so just the mid-century also. Perhaps Scott's fascination with borders also enhanced the appeal of his work, since the Midwest stood between increasingly contentious regions, serving as a buffer zone of cultural engagement for travelers and settlers alike. So in this year of the Waverly Bicentennial, I think you'll want to consider taking a Waverly tour, don't you think, through the Midwest, to see evidence of Scott's literary diaspora and legacy. And although this isn't technically the Midwest, I love the sign. It's no fish you're buying, it's men's lives. That's taken from The Antiquary in Scott's 3rd Waverly novel, and it appears in a shop that sells fish on the island of Oak Island in North Carolina, Haig's and Son Seafood, a place we frequently visit since we have children in North Carolina. And when I was talking with the owner of Haig's, when I was speaking with the owner about it, by golly, he'd been to many a Scottish celebration, indeed at the Waldorf Astoria in New York City himself, and was a great fan of the Scott novels, although he actually took the quote from another source. So they pop up everywhere. They are parts of our everyday lives, and hope you've enjoyed some of what I've shown you. Thank you.
So now it's time for questions, but first I have to share with you, and I should have told you this beforehand because you could have woven it into your talk, or better yet, you could have done this because today is International Talk Like a Pirate Day.
Oh dear, I did not know that.
And would that not have been wonderful if you talked like a pirate your entire, he would have been proud of you. It would be a whole new dimension.
Or I would have dressed differently at least. Yeah.
An eye patch or a
I know. I could have been Captain Anne.
Next year on the 19th when you speak.
Okay.
So now we're open to questions, and I will hand you the microphone because you're adding to the cultural history of Iowa City. We're filming this live, and we will re-air it forever and ever and ever. So, questions? You have to speak into this.
Are there any towns in the Midwest, Waverly is spelled with an L-E-Y?
Excellent question. That's a great question, because when I spoke with the librarian at Waverly, Illinois, she said if I ever discover why the E is missing in the Waverly names, that's the one thing she wanted me to find out in my research. I haven't run across any. What I have run across is in some publications, Waverly The novels are spelled without the E. And actually, a historian in Waverly, Iowa, suggested to me, I hope I am not misquoting him, I won't quote him, I will just suggest his idea, that perhaps it was a whole nationalization, national movement in the early 19th century that Americans wanted to change things like British spellings to make them American, sort of making the novels and their ideas their own at the time, but never run across one. If anybody finds one with an E, let me know. Thank you.
I was just curious why Scott published these anonymously.
Another great question. Well, his poetry, I didn't talk about his poetry much other than mentioning Lady of the Lake, published in 1810, so 4 years before his first novel, was tremendously important and popular. It took all sorts of tourism to the Highlands and the Lowlands, and he was very, very well known as a poet. However, novels at the time didn't have the same literary credence that poetry did. It was more esteemed, novels were not, and novels were frequently associated with women writers, who also published amazing, I mean, he was publishing just, Sense and Sensibility was 1811, just 3 years before Waverly. So Jane Austen and Walter Scott published, they never met, but they published just at the same period of time. Part of it was Waverly was so popular as the first historical novel that he kind of wanted to ride that tide of anonymity. And in fact, it brought great press. Many people thought he was a novelist, and there were a lot of debates in English and Scottish press about who might be the Waverly author. Plus, it invited women into sort of the publication of Scottish novels because they too were publishing anonymously. So there are many more novels than just Scott's during this one decade. It's really quite phenomenal how many novels were published.
More questions? Oh, good. Because I can always ask questions about dogs. I'm sure you have photographs.
Uh-oh.
I wanted to ask about the partially the circulation of the books in the United States, and particularly one of the to go back to your nemesis, Mark Twain. I mean, one of the reasons Twain blames Scott is he says, every Southern plantation had the collected Waverly novels. Every Southern gentleman read those things before the Civil War. To talk about how the book circulated, I know would be way too much, but do you know anything about how these collected editions kind of came to the U.S. and were they part of the creation of these towns that the libraries or personal libraries would have the collected works?
That's a really good question, and actually it was something I started off thinking, well, that was where the research was going to go, is why did Americans love them? I thought, well, maybe it's because American publishers had introductions that were different. Maybe there was some way in which the United States was taking these novels and making them their own. Let's see if I can answer. So when the novels came over, they were often pirated by American publishers, primarily in Boston, Philadelphia, and I believe New York, but there were 3 primary publishers. But when I went to look at the American publications, they basically looked just like the others. So I'm really not quite sure yet, and there's not been as much research on that, sort of the distribution of these novels. I will say Waverly, Iowa, though, actually has also a set of Waverly novels, 1842 editions. There are multiple editions. They were, and many times, there were cheaper editions published after the initial publications, so people had great access to them. When I went to Waverly, Illinois, it's an interesting library. The public library has a modern extension on an old Andrew Carnegie library. So I took pictures of all the different kinds of Waverly novels. They must have had 4 or 5 different editions, not of the complete set, but lots of different ones in their own holding. So it's a good question. I'm just I don't quite have a handle on that yet.
When he published his novels, what was the volume of books printed
How many?
at that time?
That is a good question. I don't have a number for you. I know that his novels went immediately into reprints. He had multiple editions published of each novel as soon as it came out. I don't have a number for you. I know that he outsold all other novelists. And one thing that also stimulated this project was I was teaching a course on Jane Austen and Walter Scott in the spring of 2013. And that January, just as my course began, an article was published in the New York Times stating research by a young scholar who had done a digital survey and was able to sort of map styles and themes. And he has shown that Jane Austen and Walter Scott were the two most influential authors of the last 2 centuries based on their styles and themes. So they were oft, novels were taken from, themes were taken from, styles and so forth from his novels. But sorry, I don't have a number for you.
If, that's the camera, it's okay.
Oh,
It's all
I
right.
keep hearing this.
Yeah, it's the camera. So could I ask Sarah if they talk about Waverly and the relationship to Waverly, Iowa in Waverly?
I think when Waverly has celebrated centennials in the past, it has come up. I think the connection to the novels has been slight as far as how much information has been shared about it. I think that would be something there would be that a lot of folks would be interested in. When you were talking about the sets of novels, I don't know if you noticed this about our edition, but it looks like it had been a gift from one person in a family. 40 years later, it was given to the next generation, and so passed down as a full set.
Wow. It's very impressive. It's a beautiful collection. I also should mention that I would like to thank the Waverly Public Library, because the research librarian who was there when I first went to Waverly, to the public library, gave me access to that. And they also, there's a lovely history published from which I quoted. I should have shown my works cited list actually, because Genevieve Bean and, I just have the other name, Mary, it'll come to me in a minute. What's that? Mary Cheville. Yes, Mary Cheville. Published a history of Waverly, which is where I discovered that that's why William Harmon indeed named the novels as he did. And you also have a number of letters and newspaper articles and other histories about the counties that were helpful in coming to these ideas. So I'm appreciative to them for their work. Yes.
And
Yes?
I'm interested in the affordability of books at that point in time. Were Scott's works ever serialized like Dickens? I mean, were they ever printed in magazines to make them more accessible to people? Or were they always just in book form?
That's an excellent question. And there are two parts of that. One is that the novels, when they first were published as independent novels. After Scott had a huge financial disaster, well, he basically went bankrupt based upon his part with James Ballantyne's publishing company, which also went bankrupt. And it was partly of a larger bank crisis in the United Kingdom at the time. And he was offered help by a variety of people. This is getting a little off topic, but he was offered help by a variety of people and said, no, I want to do this myself. He set up a way so that even after his death, the proceeds from his novels would go toward paying his debt, which had accrued. But part of that, too, he took on a large project called the Magnum Opus, which he then worked very hard, and he wrote really interesting introductions to all his novels, and then they were published as one set. And that was shortly before he died. And so that edition became well known. They weren't, though, published in the same manner as Charles Dickens or George Eliot later in the century, in that they would be published in serialized portions along the way. Now, I don't know, and I kind of wonder whether that Waverly magazine, another sort of mysterious thing I ran across, we have one volume of the Waverly magazine in special collections at the University of Iowa. But when I was doing research for a talk I actually gave in July in Aberdeen at the Walter Scott International Walter Scott Conference, I sought to find all the first editions of the Waverly magazine, thinking maybe they serialized some of Scott's novels when it first came out in the 1850s. It was very hard to find them. In fact, I can only find one library, and it's in Canada, that even had the first 2 volumes, although they were published into the 20th century, the Waverly magazine was. So I'm not as familiar with that being a popular practice. But there were cheaper editions than the originals. That's a long answer.
And we do have, Heidi, how many Waverly novels at the library?
3 or
But if you
Bravo.
if you all decide you want to read Waverly, we'll get them or we'll borrow them from other libraries. Well, we'll just send you to Waverly, and that will
Yeah.
be a wonderful little trip. Before we conclude, will you talk about the program,
Oh,
please?
I would be delighted. Yes, because I think your ad said something about paving the way. Well, the executive director of the UNESCO City of Literature has very kindly enveloped this project amongst other fabulous things ongoing. Mr. John Kenyon here in our audience. Bravo, bravo. And he's put together a fabulous book festival schedule. One of the events, which is part of that, is on page 8 of this lovely brochure, celebrating Sir Walter Scott. So this year is the bicentennial of Waverly, the very first novel, which I thought was a wonderful reason to celebrate. And as part of this celebration, it's a culmination of the visit of a Scottish scholar who will be coming to the University of Iowa, Professor Alan Riach, who's a professor of Scottish literature at the University of Glasgow. And he is a terrific scholar. He knows all about Scottish literature. He's a poet in his own right. He's written a collection of poems called Clearances, one of which is based on the Highland Clearances, and they're lovely. And he's a great teacher. And we've invited him to come to the University of Iowa as an Ida Beam visiting professor. He'll be giving talks on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. In fact, the Thursday talk, I'll just make a quick plug. It's at 3:30 in the Gerber Lounge of the English Philosophy Building. And he will be speaking to the public at that lecture. And then on Sunday, as part of the book festival, we will be having a celebration at the Englert Theatre at 3 o'clock. And it will involve a narration, seamlessly tying together all the beautiful bits from the Waverley novels, and narrated by Alan Riach, professor of Scottish literature. We'll also have a Scottish national fiddling champion from New York City coming, Jeremy Kittle, who's widely known. You should look up his website. He's fantastic. We have a world-class Scottish bagpiper living in Iowa City just now, a scientist and research scholar, a pulmonologist, who plays bagpipes beautifully. He'll be piping. We have a piper from Washington, Iowa. I think 14 dancers hailing from Des Moines, Ames, our own Iowa City. I teach Scottish dance, by the way, too. So 2 will be there from my school. And from Kansas City. One, just to give a quick hint, something involving 9 swords, maybe from The Pirate. It'll be a very exciting dance. And also songs. We'll have an opera singer, Jennifer McFarlane Hayworth from Chicago, and the Iowa City Children's Crescendo Choir, and a few other musicians too, including tenor Kevin Hannock and guitarist Jack Stapleton. They will also be accompanying some of the pieces. I think that's basically it. It's such an exciting event, I can't even keep it all straight. But 3 o'clock, Englert Theatre Sunday, of the book festival.
Perfect. Oh, and there.
No, free. Open to the public. There are many, many seats in the Englert, but I would suggest you get there early. One never knows, so seats might fill quickly. There are many other events too, and honestly,
don't forget the Saturday event with Wee Gillis.
10:30, a children's event. Wee Gillis, a wonderful story by Monroe Leaf, who wrote Ferdinand the Bull. For any of us who remember Ferdinand the Bull, it's beautifully illustrated. It's a lovely, lovely story, and a piper will indeed be on site to help the children understand how difficult it is to blow up the bagpipes, but I am not going to give the story away.
So that will be in the story time room at the Iowa City Public Library, and that too is free, of course. And I'd like you all to join me in thanking Anne for this wonderful, wonderful presentation on Scott and Waverly.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Thank you.